The storm that night in Brookhaven was merciless, hammering rooftops and drowning the streets in shadow. But what one police officer found on his own porch would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and family. A little girl, soaked to the bone, clutching her baby brother in the rain, and the truth that followed would break hearts across the town. What could drive someone to leave children out in the storm? And how far would a father go to keep his promise to protect them? Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know your city or town. Wishing you a day filled with warmth, hope, and blessings. The town of Brookhaven, Oregon, lay draped in a veil of heavy rain, the kind that turned streets into glistening black rivers and rooftops into percussion drums beneath the hammering of heaven. It was late evening, close to midnight, and the air smelled of soaked pine needles and wet asphalt, carrying a sharp bite that cut through even the thickest coats. Streetlights glowed in fractured halos, their amber light bending through sheets of rain that whipped sideways across the narrow avenues. The town, usually alive with chatter spilling from diners and porch steps, had retreated into silence, its residents hidden behind drawn curtains, fireplaces blazing against the storm's unrelenting rage. Patrol cars that normally circled the streets had been pulled back to the station, their flashing lights rare glimmers against the night. But down Maplewood Lane, headlights cut through the tempest, guided by a man who knew every turn of this town like his own heartbeat. Behind the wheel sat Nathaniel Cross, a man of 39 years, broad-shouldered and tall, his frame built not just from the demands of his badge but from the invisible weight of grief carried year after year. His hair was dark chestnut, threaded with gray at the temples, not from vanity or style, but from time and loss gnawing at him earlier than it should. His face was rugged, marked by lines etched from long nights awake, chasing suspects, filling reports, and staring at the ceiling of a too-empty bedroom. His hazel eyes were steady when he worked, sharp with the kind of vigilance a man needs to survive in law enforcement, yet softened by shadows that revealed nights haunted by memory. He had been a dependable officer in Brookhaven for over 15 years, known in the community as calm, fair, and unwilling to misuse the authority pinned to his chest. But underneath the uniform, Nathaniel was a widower who had buried his wife Grace 5 years ago after a sudden illness stole her breath and left him with promises heavy enough to sink him. He had sworn at her bedside that he would protect their children and raise them with love. That vow was carved into him as deeply as any scar. In the back of the police SUV lay his companion, his shadow, his anchor. Valor, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a coat of black and silver, thick enough to shrug off the rain. Valor's body was built like a fortress, muscular yet graceful, his presence commanding even in rest. Scars traced his fur, one along his left flank from a knife fight in a dark alley, another notch in his right ear from a training accident years before. His amber eyes, glowing like coals in dim light, were ever alert, scanning, absorbing, guarding. He had been paired with Nathaniel when he was just a year old, trained not only as a K-9 officer, but as a companion during Nathaniel's loneliest nights. Unlike friendly household pets that greeted anyone with wagging tails, Valor was discerning. His loyalty was selective, unshakable, and sacred. He tolerated strangers, but never offered them trust. With Nathaniel, his bond was silent steel. With Nathaniel's children, Valor transformed from soldier to guardian angel, patient and protective, lowering his head gently so that Ellie's small hands could hug him, or standing sentinel beside the crib of the infant, his ears twitching to every cry. Nathaniel guided the SUV carefully, wipers slashing across the windshield in vain attempts to clear the storm. His mind wandered as it often did on nights like this, pulled backward into memories of Grace. She had been small and quick-footed, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sun, and a laugh that made storms seem like summer breezes. She used to drag him outside during downpours, insisting they walk hand in hand, umbrellas forgotten, faces lifted to the sky. She had lived with an open heart, and even now, years after her death, Nathaniel still turned his head when he heard laughter in town, half expecting it to be hers. Loss had hollowed him, but his children had filled him back up in unexpected ways. Grace's memory clung to the edges of their faces, their laughter, even their silences. His daughter Ellie, only 6, carried her mother's sensitivity. His infant son Micah, just 3 months old, carried the weight of being born into a world missing the mother who should have cradled him. Nathaniel thought of them as he drove, pushing back the fatigue in his bones, the storm pounding in rhythm with the ache in his heart. When he turned onto his street, headlights slicing across the familiar silhouette of his 2-story home with its blue shutters and sagging porch, he expected the sight of refuge, but instead his heart slammed against his ribs. There, in the far corner of the porch, huddled 2 small shapes. At first blurred by the storm, they came into focus with the brutal clarity of nightmare. One was a little girl, hair plastered to her pale cheeks, her thin pajamas clinging to her body like a second skin. The other, so much smaller, was bundled loosely in a damp blanket, his faint wails almost carried away by the wind. Ellie Cross, 6 years old, had always been a child marked by thoughtfulness. She was small for her age, slender, with storm-gray eyes inherited from her father, eyes that looked older than they should, full of questions she rarely voiced. Her chestnut-brown hair usually lay neatly in braids she insisted on making herself, though tonight it hung in heavy, tangled strands across her cheeks. Ellie was cautious by nature, the sort of child who studied a room before stepping into it, who asked quiet questions at bedtime that revealed a depth beyond her years. She carried her mother's sensitivity, sketching pictures in crayons, collecting stories, humming lullabies to her baby brother with a trembling voice. Though shy and wary of strangers, Ellie had a fierce loyalty, especially to Micah. She clutched him now, her thin arms curved protectively around, his fragile body as if she alone could shield him from the storm. Micah Cross, only 3 months old, was a tiny bundle of breath and fragility, his small fists clenched beneath the soaked blanket. His cheeks were pale with the cold, his lips trembling as he whimpered, the sound weak and thin. He had been born into a home already divided, his mother gone, his father struggling, his sister shouldering more than any child should. And yet, in his presence there was hope, an innocent reminder of what Nathaniel and Grace had once dreamed their family could be. Nathaniel slammed the brakes so hard the SUV skidded before stopping. His hands shook as he threw the door open, the rain lashing his uniform instantly, soaking him through. He bolted toward the porch, every step hammering like a gunshot against the wood as he climbed. Valor leapt from the back, barking once, sharp and protective, circling the perimeter with a predator's precision, ensuring the night held no further threat. Nathaniel fell to his knees, arms scooping his children into him. Ellie's body trembled against his chest, Micah's wail weak but persistent. Their hair, their clothes, their skin, everything was drenched cold as stone. Ellie lifted her face, her lips trembling. "Daddy," she whispered, voice cracking, barely audible through the storm. Her gray eyes, wide with both fear and relief, pierced him deeper than any blade. Nathaniel pressed his cheek to her wet hair, unable to tell if the moisture streaking his face was rain or tears. He clutched them tighter, heart pounding harder than it ever had in any chase, in any danger he had faced as a cop. His promise to Grace thundered back in his ears. He had sworn to protect them. And tonight, someone had left them in the storm. For the moment, words failed him. He held them as Valor pressed close, his thick fur brushing Nathaniel's arm, his amber eyes unyielding as the storm roared around them. Whatever waited behind the walls of that house, Nathaniel knew in his bones would tear apart the fragile illusion he had clung to. But for now, his arms closed around his children, refusing to let go. Rainwater streamed down Nathaniel's face as he carried Ellie and Micah across the threshold, Valor pressing close, his paws leaving wet prints on the wooden floorboards. The storm rattled the windows, wind pushing against the frame, as if determined to force its way inside. Nathaniel's uniform clung to his skin, heavy with rain, but he didn't care. His children shivered in his arms, Ellie clinging to his collar, Micah's weak cries piercing the silence of the house. He moved swiftly toward the living room, lowering them onto the couch, grabbing a blanket from the armrest and wrapping it tightly around their soaked bodies. Valor circled once, then stationed himself near the front door, his body taut, ears pricked, as if the true storm wasn't outside, but within these walls. The faint creak of footsteps above broke through the crackle of rain. Nathaniel lifted his head, muscles tense, eyes narrowing toward the staircase. The sound was deliberate, slow, unhurried, as though whoever was upstairs had known he would return, but didn't care. Moments later, Sabrina Hale appeared at the top of the stairs. She descended with the poise of someone rehearsed for a stage, one hand gliding along the banister, silk robe tied neatly around her waist. Her blonde hair was smooth, not a strand out of place despite the chaos of the storm, and her skin, pale and polished, gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the scene, pausing briefly on the children before resting on Nathaniel. She smiled faintly, though the curl of her lips carried no warmth. Sabrina was 34, slender, her movements graceful but edged with something calculated. To outsiders, she radiated charm, the kind that drew admiration at gatherings, quick-witted, articulate, always dressed with care. But beneath the polished exterior lived a hunger that had been carved into her by a turbulent past. Raised in a fractured household, shuffled between a bitter mother and a string of indifferent stepfathers, Sabrina had grown adept at survival through appearance. She learned to win approval not by kindness, but by perfection, by crafting an image others admired. That skill had carried her into social circles where she met Nathaniel, and for a time, her composure had convinced even him that she might bring stability. Yet the cracks in her facade revealed themselves not to the world, but within the walls of their home. Her voice carried down the staircase, smooth, almost sweet, though tinged with mockery. "You're home early, Nathaniel." She reached the bottom step, tugging the robe tighter, ignoring the puddle forming around the couch where Ellie huddled with her brother. "Looks like they've been playing outside again." The words slid from her tongue with feigned nonchalance, but her eyes were sharp, watching his reaction. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He stood, placing himself between her and the children. "They were out there in the rain," he said, his voice low, clipped. "Alone." Sabrina shrugged lightly, moving toward the kitchen. The silk of her robe whispered with each step. "A little rain never hurt anyone. You coddle them too much. Children need to be toughened up in this world, especially that girl. She's far too timid." She pulled a glass from the cabinet, pouring herself water, as though the conversation were nothing more than idle chatter. Behind Nathaniel, Ellie shifted closer to Valor, her small hand buried in the German shepherd's thick fur. Valor's ears twitched, his amber eyes tracking Sabrina's movements, body rigid, a low growl humming in his throat. The sound was subtle, but clear enough that Ellie pressed her cheek against his shoulder, comforted by his presence. Nathaniel's chest burned with fury, but years of training held his voice steady. He studied Sabrina, the unruffled hair, the untouched silk robe, the deliberate calm that seemed to mock the storm and his children's trembling. He thought of Grace, of the woman who used to open the door to storms with laughter, pulling Ellie into puddles just to watch her squeal. The contrast was unbearable. Sabrina turned at last, glass in hand, her blue eyes glinting with something that looked like defiance. "You're dripping on the rug," she said flatly. "Why don't you change before you ruin it completely?" Nathaniel swallowed the words clawing at his throat. He glanced back at his children, Ellie's storm-gray eyes wide and searching his face for reassurance, Micah's tiny fists tightening within the blanket, Valor positioned like a wall of muscle and loyalty between them and Sabrina. The truth pressed heavy against Nathaniel's chest. Something inside this house was unraveling, and tonight he could no longer ignore it. Morning crept into Brookhaven muted and gray, the storm clouds lingering as if unwilling to leave, their shadows smudging the small town into silence. The roads glistened, puddles reflecting broken skies, and the scent of wet pine hung heavy in the air. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of his home, watching Ellie shuffle toward the police SUV, her small hand clutching the strap of her backpack, while the other steadied the blanket-wrapped bundle of Micah nestled against his chest. Valor padded behind, his nails clicking against the porch boards, his breath forming white clouds in the chilly air. Nathaniel felt the weariness of another sleepless night tug at him, but his duties as both father and officer demanded motion. At Brookhaven Elementary, the halls buzzed faintly with children's laughter and squeaking shoes against linoleum floors. The building itself was modest, brick walls faded by decades of storms, playground equipment flecked with rust. Yet there was a warmth that clung to the place. Murals painted by students, paper snowflakes taped to windows, hand-drawn posters encouraging kindness. Here, Children carved pieces of innocence against the rough edges of the world. Nathaniel guided Ellie to her classroom door, crouching to meet her eyes, whispering a reminder to stay brave. Ellie nodded faintly, her storm-gray eyes sliding away toward the floor, her lips pressed thin, as if words weighed too heavy to release. Valor, sitting obediently at Nathaniel's side, lowered his head, nudging Ellie gently until she offered the faintest smile and brushed his fur with her fingertips. Only then did she step inside. The woman who greeted her was Hannah Mitchell, a teacher in her early 40s, slender and tall, with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the room without effort. Her dark auburn hair was usually pulled into a simple bun, strands slipping loose around a face both kind and lined with experience. Her green eyes carried a clarity that unsettled some, but comforted others, for she had long ago learned to see past masks children wore. She had grown up the eldest of 5 siblings, forced into the role of caretaker when her father abandoned the family and her mother fell ill. Those years had carved responsibility into her bones, leaving her with patience that seemed endless and an empathy that was not performative but born from survival. To her students she was known as gentle but firm, encouraging creativity, rewarding effort more than success. She knelt when children spoke, listened without rushing, and remembered the small details, the names of a favorite toy, the kind of sandwich in their lunchbox, the song they hummed when they thought no one was listening. Over the weeks, Hannah had watched Ellie with growing unease. Once shy but willing, the girl now recoiled from group activities, her voice dropping to whispers when called upon. She bit her lip until it reddened, her hands gripping pencils so tightly that drawings tore through. The paper. When asked to draw her family, Ellie sketched herself and Micah, always side by side, sometimes adding a large dark figure with pointed ears she said was the guardian. Valor's outline appeared again and again, steady and strong, while other figures were either missing or shaded heavily in black. That afternoon, when dismissal quieted the building and the last of the children spilled into buses, Hannah lingered by her desk, sorting papers. Nathaniel appeared at the door, Micah strapped against his chest in a carrier, Valor lying at his heel, waiting. Hannah looked up, her expression careful, as though rehearsing words. She gestured toward the small round table near the window, sunlight slanting weakly through the blinds. Nathaniel stepped inside, removing his hat, the weight of the badge on his chest suddenly heavier under her steady gaze. "Mr. Cross," she began softly, folding her hands atop the table. "I wanted to speak with you about Ellie." Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it, the kind of resolve that comes when silence is no longer bearable. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. He sat across from her, shifting Micah gently against his chest, Valor settling with a sigh at his feet. "What about her?" Hannah studied him, green eyes steady. "She's changed. She avoids eye contact. She speaks only when pressed, and even then in whispers. She flinches at sudden noises. And her drawings—" She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was Ellie's, colored in uneven strokes. The picture showed a small girl holding a baby, standing under a storm cloud, with a large dog shielding them. A house loomed in the background, windows dark, crooked. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He traced the drawing with his eyes, a heaviness settling in his chest. "She's been through a lot," he said, voice low. Hannah nodded, her expression softening, but her words firm. "I know. And I don't say this to judge you, but children don't invent shadows like this unless they're living in them." She paused, leaning slightly closer. "Ellie is carrying more than a 6-year-old should. And while I know you love her, I need you to see what she's not saying." Nathaniel swallowed hard, glancing at Valor. The dog's ears twitched as though echoing his own unease. He thought of Sabrina's cold smile, her dismissive tone, the way Ellie clung to Valor's fur like a lifeline. Pieces he had ignored began to align, forming a picture far more painful than any drawing. Micah stirred, a faint cry bubbling from his small chest. Nathaniel rocked him gently, his hazel eyes lifting to meet Hannah's. For a long moment, silence hung between them, filled only by the hum of the radiator and the scratching of bare branches against the window. Finally, Nathaniel nodded once, slow, heavy. "Thank you," he murmured. Hannah's gaze softened, though her voice carried quiet urgency. "You don't have to fight this alone. If Ellie needs me, I'll be here. Whatever is happening, don't let her believe she's invisible. Nathaniel exhaled, the weight of her words pressing deeper than the storm ever could. He rose, adjusting Micah, gesturing for Ellie, who waited just outside the classroom door. She stepped in hesitantly, gray eyes flicking from her father to her teacher. Hannah knelt, smoothing a loose strand of hair from Ellie's damp cheek. "You're a brave girl," she whispered, and Ellie, though silent, leaned into the touch for a fleeting second before slipping her hand into Nathaniel's. As they left the building, Valor at their side, Nathaniel's steps felt heavier, yet clearer. The whispers Hannah had given voice to now thundered in his mind. He had promised Grace to protect their children. Tonight, he realized, that promise demanded more than shelter from storms. It demanded seeing the shadows within his own home. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Brookhaven washed clean but bruised. Branches littered the streets, shingles clung desperately to roofs, and puddles mirrored the tired gray sky. Nathaniel stood at his kitchen window, a mug cooling in his hand, eyes drifting to the porch where the memory of last night still burned. Ellie sat at the table, silent, tracing circles on the wood with one finger, while Valor lay beside her chair, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes trained on her, as though even now he refused to let her out of his watch. Micah slept in a bassinet nearby, his small chest rising and falling, fragile and rhythmic. The house itself seemed quieter than usual, almost too quiet, and Nathaniel felt the weight of it pressing against him. Later that afternoon, after finishing reports at the station, he drove back down Maplewood Lane. The rain had slackened into drizzle, the kind that whispered against windows rather than beat them into submission. As he parked, movement across the street caught his eye. An elderly woman stood by her garden, bent slightly at the waist, a pair of worn gloves covering her hands as she tugged weeds from between the stubborn roots of her rose bushes. Mrs. Doris Langley had lived across from the Cross family for as long as Nathaniel could remember. She was 70 years old, with snow-white hair pulled back into a loose bun, strands falling to frame a face lined deeply, not just with age but with memories, some of them painful. Her frame was slight, her back curved from years of tending her garden and carrying groceries alone after losing her husband decades earlier. Yet there was resilience in her posture, an unspoken defiance in the way she still cared for her home, her flowers, her independence. Doris was known in town as a watcher of details, a woman who noticed things others missed. Some dismissed her as nosy, but Nathaniel knew her heart leaned toward care rather than judgment. She brought casseroles to sick neighbors, sent birthday cards to children she had seen grow up on the street, and left roses at the graves of those long forgotten. But she also carried a burden, the quiet regret of witnessing wrong and convincing herself it was not her place to intervene. That regret weighed on her shoulders now, evident in the way her eyes lingered on his porch before sliding back to the soil. Nathaniel crossed the street, Valor following at his side, ears flicking at every sound. Doris straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her gloves, her green eyes bright but shadowed. She offered him a thin smile. "Officer Cross," she said, her voice soft, touched with the rasp of age. "You're home earlier than I expected." Nathaniel studied her for a moment before replying, his voice cautious. "Afternoon, Mrs. Langley." "The storm didn't do too much damage over here, I hope." Doris shook her head, glancing at her roses. "They've survived worse. Stubborn things, roses. They thrive even when the world tries to drown them." Her words carried a weight that made Nathaniel pause. He waited, sensing something more beneath her simple observation. She removed her gloves, folding them in her hands, her gaze drifting again to his porch. "I saw them," she murmured, almost to herself. "Ellie and the baby." Out there in the rain last night, Nathaniel felt his chest tighten, anger and shame rising together. He kept his voice even. "How long?" Doris's lips trembled slightly. "Too long. Long enough that I should have crossed the street. I watched from my window, telling myself you'd come, telling myself it wasn't my place. But when I saw her clutching that child, as if the storm itself might take him," she trailed off, pressing a hand to her chest. "I haven't slept well since." Nathaniel exhaled, the sound heavy. Valor leaned against his leg, sensing the shift in his body. Doris stepped closer, her gaze earnest now, almost pleading. Nathaniel, I know it isn't my business, but I've lived long enough to know when something is wrong in a house. Children don't look at their door with fear unless they've learned to. The words struck deep, aligning with Hannah's warning from the day before. Nathaniel felt the pieces pressing closer, forming a picture he could no longer ignore. Doris touched his arm lightly, her hand thin and warm. "I lost my own daughter years ago," she whispered. "She married a man who dimmed her spirit, little by little, until she was a shadow. I promised myself I'd never look away again, and last night I broke that promise." Her eyes welled with tears, and Nathaniel shook his head. "You didn't break anything," he said softly. "You reminded me not to." Doris's smile trembled, her grip tightening briefly before she released him. She looked at Valor, who sat alert, tail curled around his paws, and gave a faint nod. "That dog knows. You can see it in his eyes. Trust him, Nathaniel. Trust what he's trying to tell you. And trust Ellie. She's braver than she thinks, but she shouldn't have to be." For a long moment they stood there, the drizzle pattering softly between them, the roses bending under drops of water. Nathaniel glanced back at his house, its shutters rattling in the wind. His resolve, once tangled with denial, now hardened into something clearer. He had promised Grace to protect their children. That promise could no longer be kept in silence. Doris tugged her gloves back on, turning to her garden once more. "Roses grow thorns for a reason," she said quietly. "Sometimes beauty needs protection." Nathaniel nodded, his jaw set. As he crossed the street with Valor pacing close, the weight on his shoulders had not lessened, but his direction had sharpened. The shadows inside his home were no longer whispers. They were truths demanding to be faced. The evening air inside the Cross home was heavy, not with the storm outside, but with something more suffocating. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, tapping gently against the windows, but the silence inside the walls felt louder than thunder. Nathaniel sat in the armchair, boots still damp, his children nearby. Ellie was curled on the rug, sketching in her notebook, her brows furrowed in quiet concentration, as Micah slept in a bassinet beside her. Valor lay stretched across the room, his black and silver coat catching the lamplight, ears twitching at every sound from the staircase. The German shepherd had not relaxed since Doris's words earlier that day. His amber eyes seemed to follow Sabrina, even when she wasn't present, tracking shadows as though anticipating the next strike. The faint click of heels on the wooden floor announced Sabrina's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, perfectly composed as always, silk blouse tucked neatly into dark trousers, blonde hair pinned back in a twist that gleamed under the light. Her blue eyes swept across the room, pausing on Ellie with something sharp in their gaze, then moving to Nathaniel with practiced indifference. "It's too quiet," she said, voice lilting but edged with criticism. She should be reading aloud, not scribbling nonsense. Ellie froze, pencil still in her hand. She glanced quickly at her father, but Nathaniel remained still, his jaw tightening as he observed, waiting. Sabrina moved forward, her heels clicking deliberately on the wood, and looked down at Ellie's drawing. It was another picture of Valor, this time standing between Ellie and Micah, his body shielding them from the vague outline of a woman sketched in dark crayon. Sabrina's lips curved, not in amusement, but disdain. "This again? How many times must you draw that mutt?" Her hand moved suddenly, snatching the paper from the floor, and she tore it cleanly down the middle. Ellie gasped, clutching her knees, her gray eyes wide with fear. Micah stirred in his bassinet, sensing the tension, his tiny fists curling tighter. Valor rose in an instant, his body unfurled like a coiled spring, paws thudding softly against the rug as he moved forward. His ears were pricked, tail stiff, lips peeling back to reveal teeth white and sharp. A growl vibrated from his chest, low and steady at first, then deepening into something primal. His amber eyes locked on Sabrina, unblinking, unwavering, a living wall of protection between her and the child. Sabrina stumbled back a step, shock flashing across her features before she masked it with anger. "Control your animal!" she snapped at Nathaniel, her voice sharper than the tearing paper. But Nathaniel didn't move immediately. He had seen Valor react to criminals before, men with knives, suspects resisting arrest, but never had he seen the German shepherd bare his teeth inside his own home. And yet, looking at Ellie's trembling body, her small frame. Curling into itself, Nathaniel realized Valor wasn't overreacting. He was responding to something Nathaniel himself had ignored too long. Ellie pressed her face against Valor's fur, her small hands gripping his thick ruff. She didn't cry loudly. Instead, her tears fell silently, soaking into the dog's coat. Valor stood steady, muscles taut, growl rumbling like thunder beneath her cheek. He shifted slightly, positioning himself so that no angle of approach would expose her. Nathaniel rose slowly from his chair, his hazel eyes fixed on Sabrina. He remembered another night years ago when Valor had saved him during a confrontation in a dark alley. The suspect had lunged with a blade, and before Nathaniel could react, Valor had taken the hit, teeth sinking into the attacker's arm, even as steel cut his flank. That scar still traced his fur, a permanent reminder of loyalty earned in blood. Tonight, the same instinct was alive, only this time, it was his daughter being shielded. "Sabrina," Nathaniel said at last, his voice calm but laced with steel, "step back." Her jaw clenched, but she obeyed, moving toward the doorway, arms folding across her chest. "You're letting that animal run your house," she hissed. Nathaniel glanced at Ellie, then back at Sabrina. "No, he's reminding me who I should be listening to." Valor's growl softened into silence, but his posture remained alert, his body still planted between Ellie and danger. Ellie lifted her tear-streaked face, meeting her father's eyes with a silent plea. Nathaniel's heart clenched, a swell of guilt and clarity flooding him. He had dismissed too many signs, ignored too many whispers. Now, even the dog was showing him the truth. The house was silent again, except for Micah's soft whimpers and the steady breathing of the German shepherd standing guard. Sabrina turned on her heel, disappearing up the stairs, her steps heavy with frustration. Nathaniel bent down, brushing Ellie's damp hair from her forehead. "You're safe," he murmured, voice breaking. "He won't let anyone hurt you." His gaze shifted to Valor, whose amber eyes glowed steady, a silent vow written in them. For the first time in weeks, Nathaniel believed it. The days that followed carried an odd tension, as though Brookhaven itself had begun to notice what Nathaniel had tried so hard to keep behind walls. The town was small enough that secrets rarely stayed locked away, and storms had a way of making neighbors peer through windows longer, noticing movements they might otherwise ignore. At the diner, voices lowered when Sabrina's name was mentioned. At the grocery store, glances shifted toward Ellie when she trailed after her father, her hand buried in Valor's fur, her eyes shadowed in a way that unsettled those who remembered Grace's bright laughter. Whispers were growing, weaving themselves into the rhythm of Brookhaven. At the station, Nathaniel sat at his desk, fatigue heavy in his shoulders as he sorted through reports. The chatter of younger officers hummed in the background, their voices carrying the energy of men still new to the badge. One of them, Evan Cole, had been recently transferred to Brookhaven from a neighboring county. He was 26, tall and lean, with sandy blonde hair always in need of a trim, a faint stubble softening a jaw too often clenched in determination. His blue eyes were earnest, sometimes too open, revealing a sensitivity unusual in law enforcement but forged from his own history. Raised in foster care after his parents' death, Evan had known too well what it meant to rely on strangers, to navigate households that were temporary, affection that was conditional. It had left him with a quiet resolve to notice children, to protect them in ways no one had protected him. Evan approached Nathaniel's desk hesitantly, a file tucked under his arm. "Sir," he began, voice respectful, "I was covering patrol near Maplewood last night. I noticed something." His eyes flicked down, unsure if he should continue. Nathaniel looked up, his hazel eyes weary but attentive. "Go on." Evan shifted, lowering his voice. "Your daughter, Ellie. When I drove past, she was on the porch with your dog. She hesitated before coming inside, like she was afraid. It stuck with me." The words landed heavy. Nathaniel leaned back, jaw tightening. Valor, lying beneath the desk at his feet, lifted his head, ears twitching at the change in his master's body. "She's a good kid," Evan added quickly as though fearing offense. "Polite, quiet, but kids, they shouldn't look like that. Like home isn't safe." His expression softened, his own memories flashing behind his eyes. I've seen it before. Nathaniel studied him for a long moment. The younger man's sincerity was undeniable, unpolished but real. Finally, Nathaniel nodded once. "Thank you," he said simply. Evan gave a short nod in return, stepping back, though the look in his eyes said clearly that his concern was not finished. That evening, Nathaniel walked the streets of Brookhaven with Valor trotting beside him, Ellie's small hand clutching his coat sleeve while Micah slept, in the carrier against his chest. The sidewalks glistened under street lamps, puddles catching fragments of light. As they passed the general store, he overheard Janet Moore, a woman in her 50s with a round figure and quick tongue, leaning toward Calvin Reed, the retired mail carrier who had lived in town for 30 years. Janet's sharp voice carried easily in the cool air. "I saw that girl carrying grocery bags nearly as big as herself," she whispered, shaking her head, and the stepmother walking ahead like she didn't notice. Shameful Calvin, stooped but still broad in the shoulders, rubbed his chin, his brown eyes thoughtful. "I've noticed things too. The way the little one shrinks when she speaks. Children don't do that unless someone teaches them fear." Nathaniel slowed his step, listening though they hadn't noticed him. Valor pressed closer to his leg, tail flicking once as though sharing in the tension. Ellie kept her head low, pretending not to hear, though Nathaniel felt her grip tighten. He bent slightly, squeezing her hand gently, silently promising he had heard enough. Later, back at home, Nathaniel sat by the window after putting Ellie and Micah to bed. Valor lay at his feet, the soft weight of the dog's presence anchoring him. He thought of Hannah's warning, Doris's confession, Evan's careful observation, and now the whispers of neighbors. Each piece wove itself into a net too strong to ignore. For years, Nathaniel had carried his burdens alone, believing his vow to grace demanded he shoulder everything in silence. But now, the truth pressed in from all sides. He was no longer alone in seeing it. Others had noticed, and their concern lit a fire beneath his resolve. When Ellie stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly, Valor lifted his head, padding to her bedside, curling protectively beside her. Nathaniel watched them both, his chest aching with guilt and determination. He could no longer afford denial. The town was murmuring, and he would not let those whispers fade into regret. He would turn them into action. The storm returned as if it had never left, sweeping across Brookhaven with renewed fury, tearing at roofs and rattling shutters, bending the trees that line Maplewood Lane into tortured silhouettes. Lightning split the sky in jagged veins, thunder rolling over the hills with the weight of a war drum. Nathaniel's SUV turned onto the street, wipers struggling against the downpour, Valor shifting restlessly in the passenger seat, his body tense, ears pricked, amber eyes glowing with the unease of a creature who already knew what his master was about to discover. Nathaniel's gut was knotted, a premonition gnawing at him. And then he saw them, two small figures huddled again in the corner of the porch, barely visible through the curtain of rain. Ellie's thin body was curved protectively over Micah, her small arms holding him close, as if her own warmth could shield him. The infant's cries were faint, muffled beneath the storm, but Nathaniel felt the sound as though it had ripped through his own chest. His foot slammed the brake, the vehicle jerking to a halt, and before the engine had even quieted, he was out into the storm. His boots pounded against the flooded walkway, Valor leaping ahead, barking with a ferocity that cut through thunder itself. Nathaniel's heart hammered as he swept his children into his arms, feeling the chill of their soaked pajamas, the fragile weight of Micah shivering against him. Ellie looked up at him with wide, gray eyes that seemed far older than her 6 years, lips trembling as she whispered, "Daddy, we tried to wait." Her words cracked like glass in his ears. Rage rose inside him like fire, not just at Sabrina, who had again locked them out, but at himself for allowing this pattern to continue. He pulled them tighter, Valor circling the porch, hackles raised, growls vibrating through the night as though daring any threat to come closer. Nathaniel glanced at the glowing windows above, laughter faintly drifting from behind the glass, and something inside him hardened beyond repair. This house was no longer their home. It was a prison of shadows. Without a word, Nathaniel carried Ellie and Micah to the SUV. Valor leapt in after them, shaking water from his coat, his body pressing against the children, as if he alone could keep them warm. Nathaniel wrapped an emergency blanket around Ellie, tucking Micah carefully against her. "Hold him close," he murmured, his voice steady, though his chest burned. Ellie nodded, her tears mingling with rain on her cheeks. He drove through the storm, his hands gripping the wheel tight, his mind set on one place: the home of Marjorie Hale, Grace's mother. Marjorie lived on the edge of town, in a small clapboard house surrounded by towering oaks, the kind of place where books filled every shelf, and the smell of bread always lingered. When Nathaniel arrived, headlights illuminating the porch, Marjorie was already at the door, as though storms always brought. Her standing watch. She was in her late 60s, tall and upright despite the years, her silver hair coiled into a bun at the nape of her neck. Her green eyes, so like Grace's, held a quiet strength tempered by grief. Lines etched her face, not just from age but from years of mourning her daughter, a wound that had never fully healed. Yet she carried herself with dignity, her posture firm, her movements deliberate, a woman who had endured storms of her own and refused to bow. When she saw Ellie in Nathaniel's arms and Micah bundled against his chest, her lips trembled, but her hands were steady. She reached out, her voice low and full of ache. "Bring them in, Nate." The warmth of her house wrapped around them like a blanket. The air smelled of rising bread, of chamomile tea steeping on the stove, of lavender tucked into small vases. Nathaniel lowered the children onto the couch near the fire, Valor lying beside them instantly, his fur steaming as the heat dried the rain. Ellie leaned into him, her small body trembling until Marjorie knelt beside her, smoothing damp hair from her forehead. "You're safe here," Marjorie whispered, her voice carrying the authority of love, not command. She looked up at Nathaniel, her green eyes steady. "She would be proud of you, you know. Grace, you kept them safe." Nathaniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I waited too long," he admitted, the words tasting bitter. "I should have—" Marjorie shook her head gently, interrupting him with a firm hand on his arm. "You came tonight. That's what matters. Grace never asked for perfection. She asked you to love them enough to protect them. And you have Ellie, half asleep against Valor, stirred at the mention of her mother." Marjorie smiled softly, reaching for a small, worn storybook from the shelf. She opened it, her voice soothing, as she read aloud a tale Grace had loved as a child. Ellie's eyelids fluttered, her breathing evening out, Micah quieting in his sister's arms. Valor sighed, resting his head on the rug, his amber eyes glowing in the firelight, watchful even in peace. Nathaniel sat across the room, the fire warming his damp uniform, his chest heavy, but lighter than it had been in years. He knew the storm was far from over. The truth still waited to be faced. Sabrina still upstairs in the house he had abandoned. But here, in this moment, his children were safe. And for the first time since Grace's passing, Nathaniel felt the faint stirrings of hope that they might find light again. The courthouse in Brookhaven stood at the edge of Main Street, a brick building weathered by decades of storms, its steps worn smooth by the passing of generations. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was pale, streaked with thin clouds that seemed reluctant to break, and the air carried the hush of expectation. Inside, the courtroom was filled with townspeople, drawn not by spectacle but by a quiet sense that something larger than a family's dispute was about to unfold. The polished wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of neighbors who had watched Ellie grow, who remembered Grace's kindness, who had whispered their suspicions about Sabrina in backyards and grocery aisles. Today, those whispers would be brought into light. At the front of the room sat Judge Leonard Whitaker, a man in his early 60s with a frame broad but slightly stooped, his dark robes draped heavily over shoulders that had carried the burden of justice for decades. His hair was thinning and silver at the temples, his face carved with lines that spoke of patience earned and weariness endured. His pale blue eyes were sharp, searching, known in Brookhaven for stripping lies bare with nothing more than silence and a raised brow. Whitaker had built his reputation on fairness, a man who quoted poetry in his rulings, who reminded those before him that justice was not merely about punishment, but about truth. Beside Nathaniel sat Rachel Monroe, his attorney. She was in her late 30s, tall and commanding, with auburn curls tied neatly back and a pair of glasses that glinted whenever she tilted her head toward her notes. Her navy suit was crisp, her manner precise, and her voice carried the quiet force of someone who had built her career, dismantling the facades of the proud and the cruel. Rachel had grown up in Brookhaven, left for law school, and returned with a determination to use her sharp mind for those who had no voice. She had agreed to represent Nathaniel not for prestige, but for the memory of Grace, who had once been her friend. Sabrina sat at the opposing table, her silk blouse immaculate, her hair pinned back flawlessly, her posture as controlled as the mask she wore. Yet there was a flicker in her blue eyes, a restless darting when the crowd murmured, when Valor shifted on the floor beside Nathaniel's chair. His great body stretched long, but his eyes fixed on her with unyielding attention. He was not permitted on the witness stand, but his presence was tolerated as a symbol of service, and, though unspoken, as a guardian. The first witness was Hannah Mitchell, Ellie's teacher. She walked to the stand with steady steps, dressed simply in a blazer that lent her an air of quiet professionalism. Her auburn hair was tied back, her green eyes clear and unwavering. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room. She recounted how Ellie had withdrawn, how her drawings spoke of storms and guardians, how she flinched at sudden noises, how she whispered rather than spoke. Her testimony was not dramatic, but factual, and its weight fell heavy in the silence that followed. Next came Doris Langley, the elderly neighbor. She moved carefully to the stand, leaning slightly on her cane, her white hair pulled into its familiar bun. Her hands trembled as she swore the oath, but her voice, though raspy, was steady. She told the court how she had seen Ellie and Micah left outside in the storm, how she had stood at her window paralyzed by indecision, how shame burned in her still for not rushing across the street. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke, and the townspeople who had once dismissed her as merely observant now listened with respect. Finally, Rachel called Ellie. The room hushed as the small figure made her way to the front, her storm-gray eyes wide, her chestnut hair pulled into a braid that had already loosened. She looked smaller than her 6 years in the vastness of the room, clutching the hem of her dress nervously until Nathaniel rose and walked her to the stand, Valor following halfway before halting at the judge's raised hand. Ellie climbed onto the seat, her feet dangling, her hands gripping the wooden edge. Rachel's voice softened as she asked the first question. "Ellie, can you tell us what happened the night of the storm?" The girl's eyes flicked to her father, then to the dog at his side, then settled on Rachel. Her voice was faint at first, but it grew with every word. "She locked us outside," Ellie said. "Me and Micah. She said we had to be quiet. She told us, if we told Daddy, something bad would happen to him." Gasps rippled through the room, whispers breaking like a wave before Judge Whitaker's gavel restored silence. Ellie's hands tightened, but her chin lifted, and she continued. "I held Micah, but he was so cold. I thought he would stop crying. I thought maybe we both would. But Valor came. He barked so loud I knew Daddy would come back. He always comes back." Her voice cracked, but she held firm, her gray eyes steady now. Rachel knelt beside her, her voice gentle. "Do you feel safe with your father, Ellie?" Ellie nodded quickly, her small voice clear. "Yes." Always Nathaniel's vision blurred, his throat burning, but he forced himself to remain composed as Rachel guided Ellie down from the stand. The room seemed to hold its breath, the truth now undeniable. Sabrina's polished mask faltered, her lips curled into a bitter line, her eyes flashing anger, but the weight of testimony was too heavy. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his pale blue eyes sweeping the room. His voice was calm, even, but final. "The safety of these children has been endangered. Custody will be awarded to their father. The stepmother is hereby stripped of guardianship." His gavel fell, the sound echoing like thunder, but carrying relief instead of fear. In the hush that followed, Nathaniel felt Ellie press against him, Micah nestled in his arms, and Valor brushing his leg. For the first time in years, the shadows seemed to lift. The truth had been spoken, and justice had answered. Spring came slowly to Brookhaven, as though the town itself had been holding its breath all winter and was now ready to exhale. Snowmelt fed the creeks, crocuses pushed through the soil, and the heavy gray skies gave way to sunlight that gilded rooftops and dried sidewalks. By the time the spring fair arrived, banners fluttered between lampposts, and laughter echoed across the town square, the air filled with the smells of kettle corn, roasted peanuts, and fresh bread. Children darted between booths, their faces painted with butterflies and tigers, while fiddlers played tunes that lifted spirits into the breeze. Nathaniel walked through the square with Ellie at his side, her small hand gripping his, while Micah rested in a sling across his chest. Valor trotted beside them, his silver and black coat catching the sunlight, his amber eyes scanning the crowd, but less sharp with suspicion now, more relaxed, more at ease. For the first time in months, Nathaniel felt a weight lift from his chest. The trial was behind them. Sabrina was gone, and though shadows lingered in memory, the present was filled with light. Ellie's storm-gray eyes were wide with wonder, her braid bouncing against her back as she pointed eagerly toward the carousel, her voice more alive than he had heard in weeks. "Daddy, can we ride?" she asked, glancing up at him with a smile that tugged at his heart. He nodded, unable to refuse, and soon she was seated atop a painted horse, laughter spilling from her lips as the music played. Nathaniel stood nearby with Micah, Valor lying at his feet, watching the carousel turn. For a moment, Nathaniel could almost see Grace standing beside him, auburn hair shining in the sun, smiling at their daughter's joy. Nearby, Mrs. Doris Langley stood at a booth selling roses she had clipped from her garden. She waved Nathaniel over, her face creased in a smile that carried both apology and pride. She handed Ellie a small bouquet tied with twine. "Every brave girl deserves flowers," she said softly. Ellie's cheeks flushed pink as she hugged the roses close. Valor sniffed them curiously before sneezing, earning Ellie's first giggle in weeks. At another booth, Calvin Reed, the retired mail carrier, handed Nathaniel a bag of roasted peanuts. "On the house," he said with a wink, his stooped shoulders shaking with a chuckle, "for the man who finally reminded us what courage looks like." Nathaniel thanked him quietly, the warmth of community settling into his chest. As evening settled, lanterns were lit across the square, their glow casting golden halos against the gathering dusk. Nathaniel found himself at the base of the Ferris wheel, Ellie tugging his hand insistently. He hesitated at first, the thought of heights stirring old unease, but her pleading eyes left no room for refusal. Together, they climbed into the seat, Micah nestled securely against his chest, Valor waiting patiently below, ears perked as he watched them. Rise from the top, Brookhaven spread out beneath them, like a quilt stitched in lights and shadows. Ellie leaned against him, her laughter carried away by the wind, while Micah cooed softly, his tiny hands reaching for the air. Nathaniel looked at their faces, Ellie's filled with awe, Micah's with innocence, and felt a peace that had eluded him for so long. "We're okay now," he whispered, voice carried into the night. "We're going to be okay." When they returned home later, the children asleep, Valor padded to the porch and lifted his head to the stars. His amber eyes caught the reflection of constellations, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. Nathaniel followed his gaze upward, and for a fleeting moment, he felt Grace's presence in the quiet night, as though she were smiling at them from beyond. The family was smaller than it had once been, scarred by loss, tested by betrayal, but stronger now, bound not by perfection, but by love that had endured. And as dawn broke over Brookhaven the next morning, light spilling across the rooftops and into their home, Nathaniel knew that the storm had passed, and in its place lay something steadier, gentler, a life rebuilt, a promise kept. In the end, this story reminds us that even in the darkest storms, God can send us miracles in unexpected forms. A loyal dog, the courage of a child, the strength of a father's promise. Just as Nathaniel found light after shadows, so too can we trust that no matter the trials of daily life, faith will guide us through. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, subscribe for more stories of faith and resilience, and may the Lord bless and protect you and your family. And if you believe in the miracle of God's protection, write Amen in the comments below.